Have you ever wished that God would reveal himself to you? That God would just sort of come down and speak to you directly to give you a mission, or that he would do a miracle in your life, or that, maybe you would just wake up and God was staring at you and you could ask him a question. Okay, maybe that would be a little creepy. But I bet we've all wondered, God, I wish you would just talk to me. Or maybe you've just said, God, what are you doing? God, are you even listening to me right now? God, are you even real? Well, if you've had those questions, and I'm pretty sure that all of us have, you're gonna enjoy the book of Esther. Because the book of Esther is one of the most unusual and controversial books in all of the Bible. And here's why. In the book of Esther, we never read the word God. Think about that for a minute. The entire book of Esther, a book of the Bible, no one ever says anything about God. We never see anybody praying to God. We never see anyone talking about any of his laws or his commandments. God seems to be silent in the book of Esther. But this is what should make us really think about this book and why it's in the Bible, because although we're not told of any miracles or dreams or visions that God does or gives in this book, what we see is that God is at work. He's at work behind the scenes. And so that's going to be really important for us, because the book of Esther is going to show you how God works in your life, how God is at work in your family, how God is at work in your relationships at school with friends, how God is setting up your future. Because sometimes we might just think, God, what are you up to? God, what are you doing? And if you've ever asked that question, you can be sure that the Jewish people asked that at the beginning of the book of Esther. So let's go ahead and jump into our study in the book of Esther. But before we do that, we want to give you a little bit of background about what's going on when the book of Esther starts. So I'm not going to give you a long history lesson, but I just want you to understand what's going on in the life of God's people when the book of Esther opens. So what happens is God's people, the Israelites in the Old Testament, they go into a civil war. They fight each other, and they split into two nations, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. After a while, this group called the Assyrians come in, they destroy Israel, the northern kingdom, and they take them away, and they're never heard of again. But the southern kingdom, they hold on a little longer until another empire called the Babylonians, centered in modern-day Iraq, the Babylonians, they come and they take the people of Judah and they conquer them, they destroy Jerusalem, they destroy the temple, and they take the people from Jerusalem, the promised land, and they take them into exile. Now that means that they remove them from their homeland. So you can imagine what this was like if you were taken from your homeland. Let's say another army, another country invaded your country. They came to your city. They told everyone you have to move to the other side of the world. That's what happened to the Jewish people. And so God's people, now known as the Jewish people, they lived in Babylon for 70 years. And they were there because God had punished them. They'd gone generation after generation disobeying God, and as a result, God punished them by putting them into exile. Well, after 70 years, God sent another kingdom. I know there's a lot of kingdoms to keep track of, but this is the last one, the Persians. God brought the Persians forward, and the Persians overthrew the Babylonians, and they took over all this territory, and the Persians said, okay, Jewish people, you can return to your homeland. And that's exactly what they did. The Jewish people, in large numbers, they returned to Jerusalem, they rebuilt the city, they rebuilt the temple. And you can read about that in books like Ezra and Nehemiah from the Old Testament. But not every Jewish person went back to Jerusalem. Some stayed in Persia. And this is the story of Esther is about those who stayed in Persia and what happened to them. And so with that in mind, now we're finally ready to get into Esther chapter 1. God's people were controlled by a dictator. I'm calling this lesson, What is God Doing? Because God is doing some really odd stuff in Esther chapter 1 and 2. First of all, at least odd from our perspective, he's using this dictator. God's people are being controlled by a dictator. Now we meet him in Esther chapter 1, this guy named Xerxes. And Xerxes was the king of Persia. He controlled this huge area of land from the Middle East all the way to northern Africa. And he controlled that huge area of land. He had a huge kingdom, and he was really wealthy. Like, he was incredibly rich. Think of the richest person that you can think of, Bill Gates, or some sultan somewhere in the world who's really wealthy. Well, the king of Persia was probably wealthier than they were in his world. He had all sorts of tremendous wealth. People would come and they would see his vast treasures and just be astonished by this guy. And what what Xerxes liked to do is he liked to show off his wealth. And so he would throw lavish parties, and he throws a party that lasts for 6 months. Think about that, a 6-month party. And so for 6 months, he entertains all the rich people, all of his military leaders. He gets them all together and they just get wasted because they're not good people. And they're just partying. They're doing all sorts of stuff they probably shouldn't be doing. And that's what they do for 6 months. But at the end of that 6 months, the last 7 days, the king Xerxes says, hey, everybody in the capital city, the city of Susa, all of you get together, come to my house, and we're gonna invite you to be part of this party. And he says everybody can drink as much alcohol as they want, they can get as wasted as they want, and that's exactly what happens. So people are just going crazy. People are losing their minds. And Xerxes, it says, after 7 days of getting drunk, Xerxes has this idea. He wants all of his friends to see how hot his wife is. And so what he does is he calls Queen Vashti, his wife, and he tells her, hey, I want you to get dressed up, look real pretty, and I want to show you off to all my friends, and so that they can see how hot you are. Again, this guy is really a jerk. This is not, he's not romantic at all. This guy's a jerk. And so he does that. He tells Vashti to come and show herself off to all of his friends, but she says no. She says, I'm not gonna do that. She has too much respect for herself. She refuses to do that. And so the king is mad about this because he's the king and people don't say no to the king. And so the king is upset and all of his friends are upset too. Because his friends are like, Xerxes, what if our wives find out that the queen doesn't have to listen to the king? Well, then our wives aren't going to listen to us. And so they say, king, you need to do something. You need to take care of this problem. You need to take care of your wife. And so Xerxes comes up with a plan. Let's take a look at it. So if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. So they take Vashti's crown from her, and she is no longer the queen of Persia. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, why is this in the Bible? What does this have to do with my life? What was God doing? Why was God using this drunk, sex-addicted, as we're going to see, dictator? What was the point of all this? And what we're starting to see early on in Esther chapter 1 is that God is beginning to set up the story of Esther. He's beginning to put things in place to fulfill his purposes later on in the story. So let's go ahead and move on to chapter 2. Esther becomes queen of Persia. So if you move over to Esther chapter 2, 3 years have gone by. It's been 3 years between chapters 1 and 2. The king of Persia, he went to go fight a war against Greece and he lost a lot of money. And so now he's back and he says, okay, it's time for me to get a wife. I'm ready to get a new queen. And he has this idea. And again, it's a pretty sick idea. He decides that he is going to have his servants go and they're going to go throughout all of Persia. They're going to go throughout all of the land and they're going to find every beautiful virgin in the entire empire. And they're going to bring all the beautiful virgins to the capital city. The women are going to spend some time getting ready, spend some months getting ready, and then eventually they're going to meet the king. They're going to spend one night with the king. And if he likes them, then if he likes one of them, he'll make her his queen, and then the ones he doesn't like, he'll just add to his harem, basically his long list of secondary wives. Some of these kings had hundreds of wives. Xerxes' son actually had 350 wives, it's reported. And so Xerxes, again, not a romantic guy, probably like this guy who had a lot of addictions in his life, he has this plan. And so he starts getting all these women, bringing all these women to the capital. And that's when we're introduced to two people that you need to remember through the story, Mordecai and Esther. Now, Mordecai and Esther are Jews. They're Jewish people. So they are their ancestors. They came through the exile. They came to Persia. And Mordecai tells Esther, and we learn, by the way, they're not father and daughter. In fact, Esther is Mordecai's cousin, but she's an orphan, and so Mordecai raised her as his own. And so Mordecai sends her off to be part of the king's harem because he had no choice. And he says to her, now be careful, don't tell anyone that you're a Jew. So it's very important that you remember this. Nobody knows that Esther is a Jew. And so Esther goes off and she begins getting ready to meet the king. And then eventually she meets the king, and here's what happens. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in early winter of the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. So as luck would have it, and I'm kind of joking there, it's not luck, it's God working behind the scenes. As God would have it, Esther finds favor with the king and she becomes queen. She's the queen, Vashti is no longer the queen. Now, one other thing happens in Esther chapter 2, and it involves Mordecai. Mordecai saves the king. You see, we also learn that Mordecai found out about this assassination plot against the king. It says that Mordecai was at the gate of the city one day and he heard that two of the king's security guards were talking about how they were going to kill the king. And so Mordecai, he hears this, he runs to Esther, his cousin, like a daughter to him. He goes to Esther and he says, people are going to try and kill the king. You need to warn him. And Esther warns the king and the plot falls apart. The men are taken care of. So Mordecai saves the king. Now remember this story because it's going to be important later on as we continue and we wrap up the Esther story. But Mordecai saves the king. So Esther is queen and Mordecai saves the king's life. Now, we said, what's God doing in this story? Again, God's not mentioned. Chapter 1 and 2, we don't read God's name. So what is God doing through all of this? What does this mean for our lives? Well, here's what I think it means. God uses unusual events to accomplish his plans. God is at work in our lives, but he uses unusual means to accomplish his plans. I mean, think about this guy Xerxes, alcoholic, sex addicted, probably got all sorts of problems, has no respect for women, has no respect for people probably. This king is a horrible person, and we would expect God to send a lightning bolt from heaven and kill him, but he doesn't do that. God's like, Xerxes is part of my plan. Esther, this young woman who we don't know much about, she's not a person of influence, not a person of power, she becomes queen. Mordecai, sort of randomly, he saves the king's life. What's God doing? Well, I like to think of the story of Esther like an elaborate chessboard. I don't know if you play chess, but if you think of a chessboard and you have to arrange all the pieces in a certain way. And sometimes in chess, you make moves on the chessboard that seem weird, that seem unusual. Sometimes you have to let your knight get captured so that you can capture your opponent's queen. There's strategy in chess. And I think that God is setting up the chessboard, which is the book of Esther. He's using unusual people in unusual circumstances to accomplish his purposes. And so sometimes you might think in your life, God, what are you doing? God, why did you allow my parents to get a divorce? God, why did you allow our family to move and so I've lost all my friends and my connections? God, why did you force me to go to another school? God, why don't I just have the things in my life that I want, things that my friends have? Why? All sorts of things, right? You can think in your life, you might wonder, why is my life the way it is? Well, I can't tell you exactly why your life is the way it is, but what I can tell you is what God is doing in your life. And we find the answer to that in Romans 8:28. Let's take a look at it. And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. This verse says that if you are a Christian, God takes everything in your life, every experience, the good, the bad, the awesome, the horrible, the painful, all of it, God works for good. God allows terrible things to come into your life so that he can accomplish his purpose in your life. That's what God is doing. And so you might look at your life and you wonder, God, why am I experiencing what I'm experiencing? God will use that as part of his plan for your life. God isn't silent. God hasn't forgotten you. God is working his plan. And sometimes when we're in the middle of God's plan, it's really confusing. It doesn't make sense to us. But God is working for our greater good. And that's what we see in Esther chapter 1 and 2.